2 Corinthians 10:1-18. Paul defends his apostolic authority. Moreover, I, Paul, beg you, through the meanness and kindness of Christ, who, when present among you, am humble but absent, bold to you. I beseech you, then, when I am present, do not see me obligated to use with boldness the boldness which I hope to have with some who judge us, as if we were following the flesh. For if we walk in the flesh, we do not fight according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for the destruction of strongholds, destroying the counsels, and all the haughtiness that is raised up against the knowledge of God, and bringing captive all the understanding unto the obedience of Christ, and being ready to avenge all disobedience, when your obedience is fulfilled. Do you look at things according to appearance? If anyone trusts in himself that he is Christ, let him think again this, that as he is Christ, we also are of Christ. For though I boast more of our power, which the Lord hath given us for edification, and not for your destruction, I will not be ashamed. So it does not look as if you want to intimidate yourself by letters. Because his letters, they say, are serious and strong, but the presence of the body is weak, and the word despicable. Think such as this, that, what we are in the word by letters, being absent, such we shall also be for work, being present. For we do not dare to classify ourselves, or compare ourselves with some who praise themselves. But these who measure themselves, and compare themselves with themselves, are without understanding. But we will not boast beyond measure, but according to the righteous measure that God has given us, that we may come unto you. For we do not extend ourselves beyond what is fitting, as if we should not come to you, for we have already come to you in the gospel of Christ, not glorying out of measure in the works of others, but having hope that, as your faith increases, we will be abundantly enlarged among you, according to our rule, to proclaim the gospel in the places that are beyond you and not in the field of another, lest we glory in that which was already prepared. But he that glorieth, let him boast in the Lord. For it is not approved who praises himself, but the one to whom the Lord praises. 2 Corinthians 10:1-18. Second Epistle of Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 10, verse 1-18. Dear brothers, we are studying chapter 10, of the second letter to the Corinthians. Paul was very concerned to maintain his dignity and authority over the church of Corinth. However, it had no intention of going beyond the limits of this authority Lord conferred upon him. For when Paul was far away, Paul showed boldness and authority to lead the church of Corinth within the norms that the Lord Jesus established for Paul. Paul had the freedom to oppose people who stood up against Paul's ministry because they wanted to magnify themselves, causing Paul some discomfort in the direction Paul intended to give to the Corinthian church. Paul says in verse 4 that weapons used in their militancy were not carnal but powerful in God to destroy fortresses, people who stood up against the gospel of Paul, destroying the counsels, and all haughtiness that is raised up against the knowledge of God, and carrying captive all the understanding contrary to the gospel, and submitting to the obedience of Christ. Paul writes in verse 7, "You who look at the appearance when one stands up saying that it is Christ, if it is Christ, Paul says we are also." In verse 8, "Even though I glory, for I received the power of the Lord, but the Lord gave me this power for building, not for destruction." So it does not look like I want to bully somebody. On the contrary, I want edification and that all come to salvation. But we do not want to compare ourselves with anyone who magnifies himself. For these people measure themselves, and compare themselves to themselves, without understanding. In verse 13, Paul comments that he does not glory out of measure, but according to the measure that God gave him, to lead to all. In verse 15 he says we do not glory out of the measure over the work of others, but we have the hope that grows up to your faith, we are grown through you. In verse 16, Paul says that he merely announces the gospel in places beyond the Corinthians, but does not enter into the field of others, who are also preaching, and that Paul had no interest in glorying in what others are doing. For it is not good that any should glory in himself, but let him be glorified, whom the Lord glory.